Quite a bit going on over the weekend. A whole bunch of targeted active violence attacks. We're also going to talk about Trump's move. He's ordered Oregon National Guard troops into federal service to counter what he calls domestic terrorists in Portland. Roughly 200 soldiers so far are involved under the Title X federal authority. Oregon's governor and the mayor of Portland, Keith Wilson, fired lawsuits off, claiming that this was a perfect example of federal overreach, while social media is all ablaze with accusations of fascism and authoritarianism and all the other isms. Now, the bigger context, this follows Trump's executive order that labeled Antifa a domestic terror organization from September 22nd. Legal scholars say there's no statutory mechanism for designating domestic terror groups like that. And so he's making it up, but it's definitely politically explosive and, I would argue, highly necessary. The Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, approved Trump's order to federalize 200 Oregon National Guard troops. Now, they're already officially tasked with securing federal buildings, particularly the ICE facility in Portland. Now, before the ink was dry on that order, there were lawsuits lining up that argued that President Trump violated the Constitution and also federal statutes by federalizing the Guard without meeting the Insurrection Act conditions. So far, the Supreme Court has upheld that the president gets to define whether or not something meets the Insurrection Act. Let's look at the Trump tweet here. At the request of Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, I'm directing Secretary of War Pete Hegseth to provide all necessary troops to protect Portland and any of our ICE facilities under siege from attack by Antifa and other domestic terrorists. I'm also authorizing full force, capitalized, if necessary. Lawsuits say that this threat is just being manufactured for political theater. Let's take a look at this threat for a minute and see just how manufactured it is. This was, I think, last night in Portland. We'll go through a couple of these. Pause it right there. That explosion was a very large firework called a mortar that was thrown by the protesters at the federal agents. Those things have the functional equivalent of at least a quarter of a stick of dynamite in them. If you were to stick one in a tree trunk, it would blow that tree trunk to kingdom come. These things are dangerous. They are potentially lethal. If they go off in somebody's face, they could blind them. They have injured many police officers because this is a common tactic used by Antifa. And that's one of the reasons why these policemen have to be dressed up in full battle rattle with helmets and masks and goggles and everything else. Here's a woman getting arrested. These guys are not playing around, at least in terms of arresting the people that they can. Now, he's got pepper spray in his hand. That cop right there is spraying people, but some of the protesters on the left are wearing masks that would make them impervious to the pepper spray. Let's move on to the next one here.
Give us your hands! Hands open! Put your hands on your back now!
Say, get on your back. And the guy's going, no! Those guys are shooting pepper balls. You see this guy right there on the left of the screen. This is a group of volunteers. Some of them are lawyers, some of them are law students, some of them may just be regular people. They come to all these protests in Portland and Seattle and other places around the country, and they assist the protesters in getting out of jail. They take donations from all over the country, and they raise millions of dollars. And then when these people get arrested, one of these lawyers will take the guy's name and date of birth, and then they will go down and post bail for that guy. And that way he's not in jail for an hour. He never spends very much time in jail at all. He gets booked, he gets bailed out, and he's immediately freed, and he can go back to the streets. According to a list of U.S. cities by crime rate, this is 2024 data, Portland has one of the highest total crime rates per 100,000 people among any U.S. city. Some reports say it's number two. It's the number two most violent city in America. But one of the reasons why it's hard to measure it is because city data reports that Portland's crime index was 2.2 times the US average, and that the city's crime rate was higher than 98% of US cities. Portland's homicide count has trended upward. They had 94 homicides in 2023. Portland is among the most dangerous cities in America. People drugged out, laying around all over the place, sex acts committed in public. It's become a symbolic battlefield between Trump's law and order narrative and progressive politics writ large, whether that's local politics or Gavin Newsom, who I think I have a tweet that he put up here. Donald Trump is waging war on American cities. The courts have already said this is illegal, but he's pushing forward anyway. What does he mean by that? President Trump sent 4,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles to quell the riots and the attacks on the ICE facilities there. Gavin Newsom took him to court over that, and no surprise, a liberal left-wing Biden-appointed judge sided with Newsom and said, yes, this is illegal. However, an appeals court immediately struck that down, or at least put a stay on it, and said, no, it's not illegal. You have to allow the president to do what he believes is necessary. If he says that there is a compelling need under the Insurrection Act to federalize National Guard troops and send them into American cities, you have to allow him to do that until it works its way, basically all the way to the Supreme Court. So right now, there are still National Guard troops in Los Angeles as we speak. And yet Gavin Newsom lost that particular lawsuit. There are still troops there, but Gavin Newsom is pretending that the courts have already said this is illegal. This isn't about holding violent organizations accountable. No, actually it is. It is about holding violent organizations accountable. He said this is about inciting violence. How do you incite violence when violence is already happening? Let's talk about the Posse Comitatus Act. It was put in force in 1878, and it prevents federal troops from engaging in domestic law enforcement without authorization. So you can't just have soldiers, infantrymen from someplace just going in and doing law enforcement duties. And it applies to all of the different services, Army, Navy, Air Force. The National Guard is exempt from the Posse Comitatus Act if they're under state control, but they're not exempt from Posse Comitatus if they are federalized. So get that. What that means is that when President Trump federalizes National Guardsmen and sends them to California or Oregon or whatever, he is essentially sending active duty U.S. military troops into those areas. Under the Insurrection Act, which is 10 U.S. Code 251 to 253, the president can federalize state guards and even use active duty forces. They could use the 82nd Airborne if they wanted to, domestically in certain situations. They could do it at the request of a governor to suppress an insurrection. They could use it to enforce federal law when the federal law is being obstructed. And I think you could make a strong case for that taking place right now in places like California and Oregon, where the governors of the state are saying we are not going to allow federal law to be enforced in terms of immigration law. And so President Trump would be clearly able to send federalized troops into those areas. And he can also do it to protect civil rights when state authorities are unwilling or unable to do. I think you can make a case there as well, because if Antifa is blocking traffic daily, if these protests are attacking civilians, keeping people awake at night, if they are causing business owners to have to close up shop or board up their stores, then those protests / riots, they're working in contravention of the civil rights of the people who live in those jurisdictions. And the Insurrection Act has been invoked at least 30 times throughout U.S. history. So all these politicians on social media are coming out saying this is patently illegal. You can't do this. It's been done at times so far in our history. The National Guard federalization statutes, which is again part of 10 U.S. Code, allow the president to call up guard units to federal service under those limited circumstances. Now, critics argue Trump hasn't met the Insurrection Act threshold. There's no active insurrection or rebellion in Portland. Now, that federal property's been attacked, the law's been obstructive, and it's totally justified as far as I'm concerned. Courts historically defer heavily to presidents in decisions like this. Going all the way back to 1827, there was a court case called Martin versus Mott, where the court said that you've got to give the president the benefit of the doubt in cases like this. Okay. Now, let's talk about historical use of U.S. troops in U.S. cities. Go back to 1957. President Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent the 101st Airborne to enforce desegregation. The Rodney King riots in 1992, President Bush Sr. federalized the California National Guard and sent in the Marines. 63 people died in the unrest there. Back in 2020, under Trump's first term, federal agents clashed with protesters. I was there for that. And there was a lot of controversy about those guys riding around in unmarked vans. But if they don't ride around in unmarked vans, their vans get firebombed, literally get attacked, and they have to go around in unmarked vehicles. Now, Portland is absolutely in chaos. Just because you can find a street in Portland where Antifa happens not to be at any given moment doesn't mean that it's not true, that there's an insurrection going on in Portland and Chicago and many other places around the country. The left politicians from the Squad and people like that are saying that this is an authoritarian rehearsal for broader crackdowns that are going to take place across America. Now, the irony is many of these same voices were cheering for Joe Biden's Department of Justice when he was using a sledgehammer to prosecute Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. Many, if not most of those guys were eventually pardoned by President Trump, thank God. Oath Keepers leader, his name is Stuart Rhodes, he was sentenced to 18 years for seditious conspiracy. The Proud Boys leader, Enrique Tarrio, also he got 22 years for the same reason, despite not being physically present in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Dozens of others got 10 to 18 years. However, if you look back at the unrest under President Trump and then President Biden, Black Lives Matter, Antifa riots, things like that, there were a lot of arrests made, about 10,000, but almost all of those saw their charges dropped and basically faced no consequences for their actions. That's because there are a lot of left-wing district attorneys who refuse to prosecute. And so there were a few arsonists, individuals that got sentences, but no sweeping federal conspiracy cases took place. And that's because Biden's DOJ treated right-wing groups as organized conspiracies, but then treated left-wing groups as isolated criminal acts salted throughout the mostly peaceful protests. But President Trump is now flipping the script on them. And critics are losing their mind. They're setting their hair on fire. President Trump is threatening to charge rioters with seditious conspiracy. Now, so far, we've not seen that come to fruition. And there's going to be a lot of legal challenges to it, I'm sure. Why is this important? It's important because when violent people are allowed to commit violence in the name of the First Amendment, to burn cars and destroy property and attack federal agents and all that kind of stuff. When that case is made by leftists across America, what that does is it opens the door to more and more violence. There is no actual deterrent for violence across America. There's no punishment if you engage in violence as long as it's political. If you count a mass shooting as 3 or more people being shot, there have been over 500 mass shootings so far in 2025, according to the Gun Violence Archive. Now, that's a left-wing archive, and they're going to skew the numbers to try to make it look worse than it is. Bottom line is, things are dangerous in America, and we need to do what we can about it. So let's talk about what we can expect going forward. I think we're going to see more arrests and raids as the Trump administration kind of leans into the domestic terror framing of Antifa. Hopefully he will federalize a lot more troops and actually make a difference. They need to put so many troops on the ground, and they need to corral Antifa, arrest every single one of those suckers, and throw the book at them in federal court. Make some of those people go to prison for at least the next 3 years. I guarantee you, if there's a Democratic president next time, he will immediately pardon all those people. The bottom line is they need to ramp it up. We're going to see more court battles and more lawfare over the federalization of troops and the designation of Antifa as a terror group. Judges are going to have to interpret the laws because, as I said, we don't have a domestic terror group designation. Now, we could, and this is basically just going to be a narrative war for the time being. Now, let's talk about some historical precedents here. Back in the 1920s, the United States Army used aircraft and troops to suppress armed miners who were fighting against private military contractor groups that were brought in by the mine companies. The miners were actually in the right, but they were getting nowhere with the federal government, and so they took matters into their own hands, and the president had to send in the U.S. Army. That was the largest domestic armed uprising since the Civil War. So we have the ability to use force, we have the ability to use intelligence gathering, and then to try to use prosecutions to cause this to be a deterrent. But if we're not careful, we could see overreach in terms of federal authority that will, number one, get Antifa let off because it'll get thrown out of court, but more importantly, could set a precedent for a more violent crackdown on the right the next time we have a left-wing government in charge. And that day is coming. And so everything that's being done by this president will likely be tried by the next one, and it will be tried against people like you and me. We need to encourage our lawmakers to charge real crimes and prosecute conspiracies where they exist. Don't allow vandalism and assaults, but courts have to clarify how far presidential authority goes in dealing with stuff like this.